Mike Indian, welcome back to the show.
Good evening, George.
Now, what a week it's been. What a week Corbyn's had. Summarise it for us.
George, this is one of the most remarkable weeks I think Jeremy Corbyn has probably had since he became Labour leader. And
since the week before, yeah.
Well, it's been a never-ending sequence, but in long short, there has been one word on most people's lips inside the Westminster bubble, and that's been anti-Semitism. And I think listening to your opening remarks there, I think it's very clear that Labour has tried to round off the week with an intervention from Mr. Corbyn, which nearly everybody has been calling for, particularly among the Jewish community here. It was going to be in the form of a speech. That's been pushed to next week. They couldn't quite agree on a venue for it with the Jewish community. So instead, we've got this article in The Guardian. Mr. Corbyn has very clearly stated here that those who he believes are perpetrating anti-Semitism within the Labour Party are not doing it in his name. But I think what we glean from your opening remarks, and I think what we can glean from the response that I've seen so far in the short time in which this article has been out, George, is that neither side is really buying what he has to say on this.
No, that's right. But first of all, we should make it clear that this is, of course, not new. He has said that the anti-Semites in Labour's ranks, I don't know, by the way, Mike, if they're actually in the party, but they're definitely people who claim to support Jeremy Corbyn, are definitely out there because one sees them on social media. Even as someone who has blocked a large number of them, I still see them whizzing by just before I block them. People who believe that the banks are owned by Jews, that there's a banking Jewish conspiracy which has brought us low. People who believe that Rupert Murdoch is Jewish when he isn't. People who believe that the Jews run the British media when they don't. People who believe that the Jews did 9/11 when they didn't. People who believe that the Holocaust is exaggerated when it isn't, etc. These people have never spoken for Jeremy Corbyn. He's always made it clear that such people have no place in the Labour Party. He's right when he says, Mike, that they didn't kick these people out quickly enough and comprehensively enough, so that we've got people that are now under suspension and being dealt with. Labour councillors, even parliamentary hopefuls, recycling Holocaust hoax obscenities on social media. Such people have no place in British public life, never mind in something called a Labour Party. But to do as he's done this evening and throw some more people to the wolves, throw some more ideas that he's held all his life to the wolves and not satisfy the wolf, that's not going to solve this problem, is it?
I think what's very clear from this, George, is that, first of all, it's very important to stress that there is no evidence to suggest that, as you said, that any of these views are even held by Mr. Corbyn. The highest this has gotten so far has been evidence that Peter Wilsman, a member of Labour's National Executive Committee, made some rather controversial remarks that were recorded and reported in this week's Times newspaper.
Well, I've listened to them, Mike. I didn't find them controversial in the slightest. Give me your reason why you think they're controversial.
I think it's the equation of with Trump supporters. I think they're particularly stuck in many people's mouths, George. But I don't want to get into the ins and outs of whether Peter Wilson said it or not. The fact is, it generated
Well, we know what he said, Mike. We know what he said because the audio rather, secretly recorded, is extant, and everyone should listen to it. And no one, if they listen to it, can seriously say that there's anything anti-Semitic in it. No one can say there's anything untrue in it. The president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews is a Trump supporter. Therefore, to describe him as one can hardly be anti-Semitic.
I think for me it's more significant, George, that Tom Watson came out and chose to describe Mr. Wilson as a bully. This is very much airing Labour's own internal divisions here. Sure. That even after 3 years into Mr. Corbyn's leadership...
That's the pot calling the kettle black, that one, I must say. Tom Watson's most people's idea of a bully.
Are still exposing these very deep divisions within the party. And one of the things that I think we really have to focus on here is the concerted effort that's been underway to try and drive a wedge in people's lives between John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. Tell us about that, Mike.
So there's a story on the front page of the Times newspaper again this week, George, which basically suggested that Mr McDonnell has not been happy with how Mr Corbyn has been handling the anti-Semitism row, that he feels it's allowed it to spiral out of control, that it's pulling focus away from what Labour wants to be doing around marriage, is positioning itself for a possible snap election and exploiting Conservative weaknesses over Brexit. Mr McDonnell came out in response to an article penned by the Financial Times columnist Sebastian Payne, which again suggested that he was the biggest threat to Mr Corbyn, to state his solidarity with his long-time comrade. However, for many people as well, they'll be looking to the fact that the We Are Corbyn hashtag, which was pushed by the Leader's office, which Mr McDonnell took part in, was only picked up by a small minority, I should say, of shadow cabinet members. John McDonnell is standing by Jeremy Corbyn for now, and of course is publicly loyal to him. But I think that there has been evidence behind the scenes, as you said, George, of widespread dissatisfaction with the failure of the Leader's office to get to grips with this issue late in the day.
Well, there's all sorts of people been on manoeuvres. Owen Jones, the here today, gone tomorrow Corbyn supporter, is he, isn't he? The one or two other more surprising people like Matt Zarb Cousins, the Momentum Group dropping Wilsman from their slate for the Labour National Executive elections. Mr Corbyn, did he, didn't he? Mr McDonnell, did he, didn't he? There's all kinds of manoeuvres always go on in politics. It's worth restating what you just said, that McDonnell completely denies a rift between them. I don't find that all that plausible, but there you go. The Twitter hashtag that you mentioned, however, and we shouldn't allow this to pass, trended #1 in Britain 3 minutes after it began, and trended #3 in the entire world. So there are a lot of people with Corbyn, they just don't live in the bubble.
The social media savviness of Corbyn's supporters is really one of their greatest strengths, I think, John. And also, one of the things that I was quite intrigued to see was Angela Rayner was one of the shadow cabineters that picked this up, and she's someone who's often spoken about as a possible successor to Mr Corbyn down the line as well. What I think is clear here, that Labour has gone through a big week here where one of its most long-running issues in the quietness of the summer has been allowed to burst forth again. I'll be interested to see if Mr Corbyn makes a speech next week trying to address these remarks. For me, it's really a question of how he can clearly state his position whilst condemning anti-Semitism, also making it clear that his own beliefs, his own supporters are entitled to their views as well, as long as they do not infringe upon or cause offence to a certain group of people. And this, I think, is where the selective adoption of the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism has really been bad politics for Mr Corbyn here. He spoke there about his authenticity there, George, and I agree that's his best asset as leader. But it's also, I think, one of his weaknesses as well, in the sense that sometimes, whereas other leaders might be more comfortable to make what we might call compromises, Mr Corbyn finds himself time and time again in difficult, almost tortuous positions, particularly for his long-held history of campaigning with certain groups, and that's a stick that those who oppose him to beat him with.
And of course, these compromises, transactional politics, which is the antithesis of Corbynism, are underway, have been for several weeks in this issue. But apart from being rather tawdry, they don't work. As we agreed at the beginning of this conversation, it's not that you can sell out and the person to whom you're selling out will gratefully take the people and things you're selling out and say, thanks very much, the war is over. They bank the things and the people that you have sold out and come back for more, don't they?
I want to see what happens in the next evolution of Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn's entered this third year of his Labour leadership very much secure and in control of most of the party structures here, besides opposition within local government, which is eroding, and the parliamentary Labour Party, which, if Corbynism remains intact over time, will deal with that sort of turnover within inside the parliamentary party itself. But one thing I think was quite intriguing was the main effort beyond this sort of local elections this year was the push towards Labour Live, and still focusing very much on the sort of cult around Mr Corbyn himself. If his movement is to survive within Labour as a creed, it has to find younger, more viable members who speak for a broader section of the party. Jeremy Corbyn brought all the people in, through his personal appeal, I think, but I think the ideological roots of Corbynism are still quite shallow. There's still a number of different factions within Labour. If you just look at the number of groups that particularly embody the proliferation of websites like Novara Media, the Canary, that have been drawn in very much by opposing the Tories, the person who follows Mr. Corbyn as Labour leader has a bigger challenge in holding the largest political party in Western Europe together, particularly if it's in government at that time.